9 strategies that help STEM organizations retain women and everyone else. My name is Stephanie Slocum, founder of Engineers Rising LLC. I'm an engineer, author of a book called She Engineers, a keynote speaker, a trainer, and a coach. The data and insight that I will share with you today are from case study interviews that I conducted of current and emerging women leaders, non-binary leaders, and male allies. I conducted those interviews between October 2021 and January 2022. Findings from these interviews were categorized as follows. First, individual success trends. Second, accelerated leadership paths. Third, organizational success trends. And finally, the roadmap, practical strategies to affect change. Now, I looked at practical strategies for change as it relates to organizational structure, individuals, and what allies can do. In today's video, I am going to focus on the organizational side of this, particularly practical strategies for organizations who are committed to gender equity. If you're interested in hearing more about the data from the other 3 areas you see up on the screen, I invite you to go ahead and grab a copy of the She Leads STEM 100 Leaders Report, which documents all of the data found as well as gives you practical insights. This is really good information to have whether you are mentoring someone else, whether you are trying to accelerate your own path to leadership. And you can get the whole document for free. Just access it via the QR code that you see on the screen or the links that are in the description accompanying this video. So let's dive into these practical strategies for organizations. I call this the roadmap, and you can see a graphical representation of the pieces of the roadmap up on the screen in the form of a wheel. So when you think about a wheel, let's think about a wheel in a car. It has multiple parts in the wheel, but the most important part is the rubber that goes around the outside. You're not going to go very far if that wheel gets flat. The wheel also includes 8 spokes. Those spokes are feedback, flexibility, growth, bias training, promotion paths, fair pay, opportunity, and accountability. Organizations that are mature in their commitment to gender equity will have addressed both the overarching wheel of belonging and also these 8 spokes. I will talk about each of them in detail momentarily. But the reality is, most organizations can make significant progress in their ability to retain women and a diverse workforce and leadership pipeline by addressing only a few of these. Where organizations go wrong here is implementing policies and procedures in these 8 areas, what I'm referring to as the spokes, without addressing the bigger issue of belonging. And in case you're wondering why belonging matters at all, there are many other studies outside the scope of mine that attach a business case to this. Belonging is related to something called psychological safety, which is the #1 trait that Google found in their research that resulted in a higher performing team. Higher performance translates to making or saving an organization money due to more productivity and lower recruitment and retention costs. You can't fix a retention problem by addressing the 8 spokes of the roadmap without addressing belonging. That's a theme I heard over and over again in my case study interviews when I asked current leaders why they stayed in their current organizations. So the essential takeaway from this video today is that if you are an organization who is struggling to retain women, to retain diverse individuals, if you're struggling in general with retention, belonging is the most likely culprit with a caveat. So the caveat here is assuming that you are at least paying and giving benefits that are at a market value rate. If you are way below market value, you're going to have trouble retaining anyone regardless. But once those basic needs are met, belonging is where to focus. So what do I mean by this? And so let me give you 3 examples of organizational actions that teams can take to help cultivate belonging. And I'm going to give you 3 examples now. You will see many more examples in the She Leads STEM report itself, and not just for organizations, but actions allies can take, actions individuals can take. If you are, for example, an individual contributor at a lower level in an organization and you're feeling like you don't belong, I share some practical things you can do in the full report as well. But back to organizations, 3 examples of actions you can take to cultivate belonging include recognizing and rewarding the individual differences that contribute. So essentially, this is, we don't create a one-size-fits-all role where we have all these people with the same titles who are recognized for the exact same things. What we want to do is we want to develop the individuals and appreciate all the differences that as a team create more than any of the individuals could on their own. Second, do not tolerate bullying or toxic high performers. Many of the case study interviewees I talked to had cited this specifically as a reason they were no longer working at a prior organization. Tolerating someone who is producing but is bringing a bad attitude, who is bullying, who may be harassing people, using their power in a not good way. That is a very good recipe for driving your high performers, your top talent, and everyone else out of your organization. One third example is providing support. And when we're talking about support, often the first thing people will think of will be mentorship, employee resource groups, but it turns out the most important piece of support that top talent wants and will help keep them within an organization is a manager that cares and wants to develop them. Again, you can see many more examples of organizational activities you can do to promote belonging, as well as what allies and individuals can do for each of these parts of the wheel, with belonging again being the most important part. And so I invite you to go check out the full report. I'm giving you the highlights in this video today. Now we're going to take the spokes of our wheel one by one. First up is feedback. And so why is feedback important? Feedback is important because people need to know both what is expected of them to be successful within their roles, but then they need to know what they're doing well and they should keep on doing more of, and they need to know what they're not doing well. Studies have shown that if you have high performers and a manager is completely hands off with them, often the high performers will end up stopping doing some of the things that are making them very successful simply because they don't have the feedback they need to know those are some of the things that are very valuable in their role. And so with high performers and everyone else, for people you want to retain, routinely acknowledging and celebrating their successes in small and large ways is a very low-hanging fruit, something that's very low cost and easy to do, even for the smallest of organizations, that will help retain your top performers. Training managers to provide objective performance reviews and feedback. Studies have shown, for example, that men are more likely to receive objective feedback and women are more likely to receive subjective feedback. So an example of this is a man is more likely, statistically speaking, more likely to get feedback that is something to the effect of, in that meeting, it felt like you weren't prepared, you went through these particular slides, you didn't sound like you were confident, or you practiced enough. That sort of feedback someone can take and say, okay, next time I give a presentation, I can practice it more, I can practice it out loud, I can make sure I am confident in what I'm doing. Contrast that with feedback where someone says, in that presentation yesterday, it felt like your executive presence wasn't there. That type of feedback is something that is very difficult to do anything with. You don't have a specific example of what you can do to improve. And so that was one example. I can give you many more, and you can go check out some in the report about why providing feedback, be it day-to-day feedback or within performance reviews, is essential if you want to retain your people. And then finally, one last example of feedback is supporting 360-degree feedback. And it's not just supporting it, it's supporting it without backlash. So what do I mean by that? That means that when you ask the lowest level person in the organization, they are just as comfortable giving feedback up the chain, so to their manager, to their boss, as their boss or manager are giving it to them. We're creating a culture of feedback where everyone is trying to learn and grow and are learning from each other. The next stoke we're going to talk about within our wheel is flexibility, and I'm specifically talking about workplace flexibility. A lot of people, especially if we're talking about retaining women, immediately jump to things like maternity and paternity leave. And yes, that is one example. Other examples of work flexibility could be everything from a sabbatical to benefits around daily or weekly flexibility, or where and when you work. So do you have a remote work policy? Are you looking at a hybrid workforce, or do you require everyone to be in the office? And so from an organizational standpoint, 3 things that you can do to advance your workplace flexibility policies so that you can better retain women include, number 1, actually having a policy. When I talked to a lot of the interviewees, there was a general sense that in most organizations, there might be a policy which may or may not be enforced, but often it was up to individual managers to allow the use of this policy or not. There was little uniformity from, at least according to the interviewees I talked to, around like when and how you could use the different policies. So developing a policy and making sure everyone applies similar standards to using it is a great first step here. As you're developing those policies, including the people that the policies affect when you are creating it, is essential. It's not just for, to make sure you're not missing things, but also to get buy-in across the organization for what you're trying to do. And then finally, just having a policy doesn't tend to be super effective, particularly if you don't already have that culture of belonging that I talked about earlier. And so when you have workplace flexibility, the importance of leaders, so leaders, managers, very high-ranking people at the company, modeling use of those flexibility benefits is imperative. Why? We see in too many organizations that there is still a stigma attached to taking workplace flexibility benefits, and that sometimes organizations will offer those benefits, yet if you take them, there is a perception that you might not be as ambitious. You might not have the drive to be successful or to get promoted. And so how do we fix that? We fix that by having leaders that model that workplace flexibility. And in fact, there weren't very many of these interviewees, but the handful of the interviewees I talked to who said, I have been at my company for 5, 10, 20 plus years, and I never plan on going anywhere else. This was one of the things they cited. They said that the reason was because the leadership at the highest level positions within my organization, they model not just a leadership style that works for me, but they model the kind of lifestyle outside of work that I want to have. And often those interviewees I talked to would talk specifically to things like work-life balance. I see the people at the top of my organization taking vacations, having a life outside of work. And that was the type of leader that they wanted to work for. So continuing along in our Stokes. So we have 8 Stokes. We talked about feedback. We talked about flexibility. Now we are going to talk about growth. So what do I mean by growth? Put simply, it's providing professional development opportunities. But this is not just any kind of generic professional training opportunities. Again, we are looking for, and your top talent is looking for individualized professional development. They're looking for the recognition that every person in the company is an individual with unique skill sets, talents, and gifts. And they want those gifts to be recognized and then grown and nurtured within their environment. And while outside the scope of this particular study, there is much research that backs up this idea that when you have people with particular skill sets and you align those skill sets with a role in your organization, when those line up, that those employees are more productive, there's less absenteeism, they make more money for the company. And so what are some examples of this? And these are examples that came directly from the mouths of people I interviewed. Those examples included their own time and budget provided for professional development. They had a allotted bucket of hours or money that they could use to allocate as they saw fit, of course, with the approval of their manager. Having career conversations, so establishing manager and employee co-created written development plans about both short and long-term career goals, and helping people identify what their strengths are within the organization. Particularly for young professionals, often when they start out working, they don't necessarily know where they're going to fit in the overall company, where they're going to fit in the industry. And so managers that take the time and organizations that take the time to support helping people figure out what their strengths and then helping them align those with the best places for them in the organization, that creates a lot of loyalty for the people you are nurturing and growing. And that loyalty translates into great retention statistics. So next up is bias training. Why did bias training make it into the wheel at all? Well, many of our interviewees noted that we make, as humans, a lot of unconscious assumptions about individuals. And this isn't necessarily just related to gender. It could be age. It could be if you are a caregiver or not. It could be all sorts of identity characteristics from race to if you're a veteran or not. And so the reason bias training can be very effective is because what it does is it facilitates a conversation around a standard of shared behavioral expectations. And when people know what to expect, when they know what types of behaviors are rewarded in their organization, and especially if those behaviors promote belonging, again, there's a reason why belonging was the biggest, most important thing. And what bias training does is it enables that conversation to continue and advance. Bias training, when it is all about compliance, is not effective. That is not what I am talking about here. I am talking about bias training as a vehicle to facilitate what can be very hard conversations. And this is particularly important as it comes to things like hiring and promotions. Next up, we're going to talk about promotion paths. Now, most people would say, if you're thinking about where you personally would like to work, you'd like to work somewhere where you can grow, where there is an opportunity to advance. Now, our interviewees talked about the fact that when it came to promotion paths, many of them had struggled at previous organizations. But they found that when promotion paths are transparent, objective, and what do I mean by objective? That means there is a written criteria that is shared with other people. That typically also means there's more than one person, and preferably a group of diverse individuals with different backgrounds and experiences making the decisions about who gets promoted. Those two things have to be in place, and then they need to be available. So growth promotion paths need to be available for people with different skill sets and talents. In other words, if you often feel like right now there are a lot of people in your organization that when someone is promoted, they're left scratching their heads and wondering, why did that person get promoted? That is a red flag that this is a place that would be worth focusing if your goal is to retain women and other top talent within your organization. Next up is fair pay. Now, this was a case study interview, so I did not go into these case study interviews with an agenda of studying fair pay. But one thing that came up over and over again was this question: what does your data say about pay equity? I talked to more than one female leader who said that when they were promoted into a position where they were responsible for hiring and payroll, they found out that they were grossly underpaid. And so in most of those cases, they brought it to the attention of other management. It was immediately rectified, and they are still with those organizations. But there were also instances where that destroyed that person's trust for the organization forever, which meant that someone who had been groomed for leadership and was on a leadership track ultimately left and took all of those skill sets elsewhere. The seventh of our 8 spokes in our wheel is opportunity. One question to ask yourself, particularly if you are responsible for assigning work or determining who gets which project, is if all genders of all identities are getting a fair shot at high-profile projects and leadership development. Some of the interviewees commented that this really showed up when they were trying to advance from middle to senior management, because they often found that, particularly if there were very few or no women in senior management, they struggled to get the one-on-one mentoring and some of the strategic initiatives related to the company that they noticed their male counterparts were getting. And so looking at, okay, make a list of the high profile projects. How is it being decided? Who gets what? Are all identities getting a fair shot? Is a good question to ask and a great place to start, according to those we interviewed. So finally, let's talk accountability. And the fundamental question here is, what story does your retention data tell? What story does your retention data around women or people that don't look like many of the other people in your organization? More than one of those I interviewed had a similar comment to the one that you see up on the screen right now. I've noticed an unwillingness to look at the data. As a leader, if you don't have women throughout your organization, including at the highest levels, if you are not retaining them, you have to be willing to ask, why? What's going on? That has been challenging in some of the organizations I've been in. It's like we can pretend there isn't a problem if we don't look at the data. That wraps it up for the 9 strategies that STEM organizations can use to retain women and everyone else. As a reminder, the model for this is a wheel, where the biggest part of the wheel and the most essential part is that sense of belonging within your organization. Once you have that or made some substantial progress on that, you can add in additional tools, which we're calling the spokes in this case, and 8 of which you can see up on the screen that came from my case study interviews. Those 8 spokes are feedback, flexibility, growth, bias training, promotion paths, fair pay, opportunity, and accountability. In our time we've had together today, I've only been able to give you a snapshot of some of the practical strategies that are in section 4 in the She Leads STEM 100 Leaders Report as it specifically relates to organizations. There are also practical strategies in that section for allies and for individuals who want to advance in their organization. There are also several other videos highlighting parts of this report in sections 1, 2, and 3 on this channel. And you can access the entire report for free using the QR code you see on the screen or the links that are in this video's description. If you work in an organization that wants to retain women or are a current or aspiring leader, you definitely will not want to miss the exclusive data and insights that you'll find in this report.